Thank you everybody for attending today. I'm really excited to have the opportunity on behalf of West Point Women to introduce Michelle and Alex, who are going to share with us some tips and techniques and best practices to get you ready for the Army Combat Fitness Test that is going to roll out and be active sometime in the future. Thank you both for giving of your time, both in the time that you're giving us today, as well as all the time that you've spent preparing for this webinar. Michelle, you want to take it?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. So first thing, good afternoon from the East Coast. I'm Michelle Thibeau, and I'll be your host for today's West Point Women's webinar covering all things Army Combat Fitness Test. I work full-time in data management, and I'm also a pregnancy and postpartum athleticism coach. And I am beyond excited to host one of West Point Women's first male panelists, Captain Alex Morrow. Alex, welcome. Would you like to tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Michelle. I'm currently working at the Army Physical Fitness School, where we teach ACFT certification as well as the Master Fitness Trainer course. And I'd heard through a few people that this community had a particularly good conversation going on about like angst surrounding the ACFT and how to better implement it and train for it. So thought it'd be a good topic to chat about.
Yes, awesome. And we are so appreciative to have you, especially hearing it directly from the source. That means a lot to us. So Alex, I went through the Master Fitness Trainer course back in 2014 when H2F was not yet in existence and very far away from being implemented. Can you please explain what H2F is, what its creation means to leaders, and how H2F is associated to the ACFT?
Yeah, absolutely. So H2F is holistic health and fitness, and you already kind of addressed that the ACFT is just one small piece of a much bigger program that the Army's implementing right now. People who are in hopefully know that FM 7-22 has already been revised, the new version published a couple months ago, and it's still FM 7-22, but it's holistic health and fitness as opposed to PRT, which everybody's familiar with. For those that don't like PRT, sorry, most of it is still in there. It's just kind of an expansion on it to bring in more factors. But like you said, when you came to the course in 2014, it was very much just a class in executing PRT properly. The course has evolved a lot since then. Now we're teaching more foundational strength and conditioning, a little bit more like anatomy and exercise science, so that these guys have a strong foundation in how to train people in general, PRT just being one tool of that. H2F more broadly, those who've served in special operations units are certainly aware of the Thor 3 program. The idea of H2F is to bring resources like that to the conventional force. So Fort Bragg, Fort Drum are in the first year. I think Fort Bliss as well is also part of the first year, and the rest of the Army will get these resources over the next 5 or 6 years. But brigades will be seeing strength coaches, physical therapists, occupational therapists, and a whole suite of kind of resources that they've had a hard time getting access to. And it should dramatically improve both access to care if you're injured, but more importantly, real professional strength and conditioning so that people can be in shape and not injured and really avoid needing that access to care in the first place.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. It seems like the military rolled out a really big task with the new ACFT, but it's really looking to provide a lot of answers and resources along the way. So that sounds like a fantastic plan. And without further ado, I want to skip to what is at the forefront of a lot of folks' minds, especially this community here. Everyone's favorite. Let's talk about the leg tuck. How long can we expect the alternate event, the plank, to stick around, and how can we better prepare for the leg tuck?
Yeah, absolutely. So according to the current guidance that we've seen, if anybody wants to really dig into it, it's XSWORD 219-18, tons of fragos, hopefully revised soon. But right now, everybody knows that there's no consequences to failing the ACFT for the next year and a half or so. That currently is the same time that the plank is in effect as an alternate event to the leg tuck. So what I tell people is to focus on training for the leg tuck regardless, because we can't count on the plank staying past that. But I'll put a big asterisk on that and say that this stuff is all being reviewed right now. DAG1 is looking at it. We know that there's not real clear policy yet, and they're trying to make sure that, as a lot of people in this group I'm sure have discussed, we don't want to see disparate impact on the professional opportunities for women. We know that the data is showing some discrepancies. Some of that comes from fitness culture and things like that, but some of it also does come from just how much work it takes for your average male to get a certain score versus how much work it takes for your average female to get a certain score. So we mentioned this just before we came on the call, but I will be passing along a leg tuck program to you that the Army Physical Fitness School put together. It's a pretty handy tool, mostly built by one of our physical therapists, but it will help identify what particular weakness is causing somebody to have issues, because it's not the same for everyone. And from there, it slots you into the appropriate program for solving that problem. And especially since this group is full of leaders, getting that tool out to the individual soldiers who are struggling is going to be critical.
Yeah, to kind of piggyback off of that, how as master fitness trainers do you approach training for women differently than for men?
Yeah, so this is a big question that you'll see across the strength and conditioning industry. I think part one is it's not necessarily about women versus men. It's about individualizing in general. Training an extremely fit woman might be very different than training an unfit man, and vice versa. So you have to understand the individual situation that whoever you're coaching is in. That said, there are differences, and there are certainly differences in like predispositions to be good at certain things, especially based on the training people have been doing in the Army so far. Not a lot of upper body pulling has happened. Some men just kind of get away with that and can still do a leg tuck or two. Women might find that they have to do more work up front to get that first leg tuck, but that's all about identifying the individual needs of a soldier. I know we'll talk at the end of this about some resources people can pursue, but if you're active duty and you're really interested in the nuanced differences of how to train women versus men, Meg Cruz is doing awesome work with the Valkyrie Project. She's out at Fort Bragg, still active duty right now. Really cool stuff happening there, and she's pushing forward on some research projects to refine what we know about like what programming changes make the most impact.
Yeah, Alex, I love how you keep talking about it's not one size fits all. It depends on the individual soldier. And this really brings me back to the question of what should we as leaders be expecting from our unit master fitness trainers?
Absolutely. And this is one of the biggest problems we currently have with our program. The most consistent AAR notes we get from NCOs who come through our course is, one, it's the best course I've ever been to in the Army, and two, my leadership doesn't let me use it. So that's clearly a problem we have to fix, and we have to make sure leaders understand the role of an MFT and how to use them effectively. Most commonly, we see commanders or first sergeants making them in charge of running all the tape tests, in charge of running all the PT tests, and then the tack onto that is usually remedial PT for people who are failing, or ABCP, something like that. All of those are important, and we know those are the things that get flagged in training meetings that you need to be able to answer how you're fixing those problems on your slides. Got it. Understood. But the best way you can really use an MFT is to design training programs for the whole formation. They should be looking at injury data, what the most common injuries you're seeing are. They should be designing assessments for your unit. I know everybody's worried about training for the ACFT right now, but one of the messages we try to drive home with all of our students is, even with a better test, we should not be training to the test. We should be training for the mission. Identify your most physically demanding mental tasks, identify what soldiers are good at there, what they have weaknesses there, and train for that. And the PT test will take care of itself.
Yeah, awesome. So we talked about what an MFT can do for a commander. What can a commander do to support an MFT?
Absolutely. And I think this is going to be huge, particularly right now in the strange situation we're in, where soldiers know there's no enforceable PT test for like at least a year or so. COVID is limiting units' ability to do training in person. That's not even getting into the problem of Compo 2 and 3, so our Reserve and National Guard units. But it's a complicated time for Army physical fitness. What commanders can do with MFTs is challenge them and enable them. I've seen some really unique programs put in place, some kind of competitive structures where soldiers report their scores on workouts. So even if they're working out alone, they can compare how they did to their peers. These are all things that MFTs can do if they have the time to do it. We know it's an additional duty. We know they have full-time jobs, but if a commander can give them the time and space to emphasize this kind of stuff, I think they can have a pretty massive impact on not just performance, but the morale of the unit.
Yeah, and I think this is a great time too to highlight to commanders and leaders of all sorts, not just the ability to say, hey, there's not really this punishment behind not passing, but this is my opportunity to show some creativity and rewarding individuals for their hard work and their own creativity in training for the ACFT. How has COVID affected the rollout of the ACFT, and what can commanders do to best set their soldiers up for success during this time?
Yeah, this has been a tough one. And I know there were some articles and social media posts at the beginning when we were first learning about COVID saying, oh, like bad timing, I guess the ACFT is not happening. The ACFT is in fact happening. Yes, there are limits on like what we can do to train, what we can do to test right now. It is still coming. It might be a slightly slower implementation than we expected, but the real test we've seen is how do you help soldiers train for it when they can't come in person? They can't necessarily use gyms, whether on post or off post. How do we get smart and creative about training them for this? You'll hear a lot of people say, well, I can't train for a deadlift if I don't have access to a gym. And that's, I mean, honestly, that's just not true. There are absolutely ways with no equipment. There are ways with very minimal equipment. We've seen NCOs put together some really cool programs using only TA50 that all of their soldiers have, just rucksacks and things like that. So we need the biggest challenge of COVID right now is keeping people healthy in a like cardiovascular and strength sense, in addition to not getting COVID. So creative programs that get soldiers engaged. People are constantly asking for the fitness school to put out workouts and training programs and things like that. And I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think the soldiers who were going to train on their own at home are already doing it, and they're not waiting for us to post something on our Facebook page. And the soldiers who weren't going to train at home on their own probably aren't going to start just because we post a cool program. So I think a lot of this comes down to leadership, culture, getting people like motivated and excited to do some of this training. So the resources are out there. We've produced lots of them. There's also tons of awesome stuff on YouTube and various companies putting out really good content for both civilians and soldiers. It's a matter of getting people to start doing it.
I love it. And I love hearing good news stories about creative solutions, especially people sharing that kind of stuff on social media. It goes a long ways and can definitely make an impact. I'm curious, and I know beforehand you've shared a few good news stories with me, a few different narratives. Would you mind sharing some about training folks for the leg tuck through your job?
Yeah, absolutely. I know we had a conversation about people saying they can't do something and just shifting the mindset. So it's really cool to see, particularly women who come in thinking they can't do something and then realizing that it honestly doesn't take too much to get to where they absolutely can do it above and beyond the standard. I've had two particular ones that I think were really cool. One was a female E8 who came through the course. She worked in like a very non-traditional unit, a lot of civilians, a lot of senior officers, not a lot of organized PT. She was older, not terribly fit, pretty short, like all things that statistically led to not as great performance in the ACFT. She came to our course, unable to do a leg tuck and really uncomfortable with the deadlift, not doing very well. Fast forward like a few months after the course, get an email from her. All of a sudden she's able to do 7 leg tucks, deadlift 180 pounds. A couple weeks later, get a follow-up email. Now she's deadlifting over 200 pounds and in the double digits for her leg tucks. So really cool to see in a relatively short period of time, a really dramatic improvement. And I talked to her about the fact that Master Fitness Trainer is not a course to help individual NCOs better themselves. So what I really want to see is her taking what she's learned from that process and sharing it with the rest of her unit, particularly those who are struggling. And at the other end of the spectrum, some people, it's not a lack of strength that's preventing them from doing a leg tuck. It's just a lack of familiarity with the movement and a little bit of coordination stuff. The single biggest coaching cue I give to people, hopefully some people here find it useful, is just look backwards. Try and lean back as you try and do a leg tuck. I've seen women go from unable to do 1 to seconds later, once they figure out how to engage their lats and their rhomboids, doing 7. So maybe it's not like you might be doing all the strength work and not seeing the results you expect. And maybe we can solve that through some simple coaching cues.
No, this is great. I hope some folks actually take that saying, throw it in their rucksack for coaching folks as they go through this. And I think this is something not just MFTs can benefit from as they continue to coach certain people in their unit, but this is something that all leaders in the military can use. I think all of these different coaching cues, you can't expect all of them to work for everyone 100% of the time. But if it continues to pay off in small amounts for different people, I think it's great to have a diverse set of things in your rucksack to be able to share with them. This next topic, I am going to take the mic here for a second. So when I was in the military, active duty, I was often the person who would preach, especially to my female soldiers who were returning postpartum, that we had about an equal amount of time to meet the Army Body Composition Program standard, as well as the fitness standard for the APFT. And I know there has been a recent shift, probably positively, to allow women 1 year postpartum to pass the ACFT. However, the standard for meeting the Army Body Composition Program timeline has not changed. And so the advice I used to give was focus on your strength, and your ability to meet the standard for the Army Body Composition Program will follow. I feel like that entire dynamic has been turned on its head in an almost unhealthy way. And so I'm wondering, from the schoolhouse and also from your leadership experience, what advice you would give to these women when it almost feels like there's more of an emphasis on losing weight and fitting back in their uniform than to gain the strength and recover accurately and well enough for the ACFT.
So before I answer, I'll give a disclaimer that I should have given up front. Anything I say here is my personal opinion and is not reflective of the physical fitness school, of the Army, of CIMT, of anybody involved in the ACFT. So the first thing I'll answer is, yes, with the publication of the new FM, it indicates a 1 year timeline before you're taking an ACFT again postpartum. It's important to note that that's a field manual and not a regulation, and the regulations are being crafted now. So we'll see what happens. That's the intent. I would love to see something more individualized, honestly, where the timeline to return is driven by input from an actual medical provider who knows the individual woman's situation, because every pregnancy is different and every delivery is different. And we should be smart about what the timeline to come back from that is. At the same time, we've seen a ton of questions about, is the Army Body Composition Program going to be revised? And the answer you commonly hear from Army senior leaders is no. And on the surface, that's kind of true. And it's because ABCP is not driven by Army policy. It's driven by DoD policy. It's a DoD instruction. I don't remember the number offhand. I can find it for you later if you want. But I think the DoD is looking at it. It's just not Army leadership that's looking at it. Some of the people in this group might be aware of the study happening at NADIC right now, looking at like high performing women who've been successful in some of the elite selections in schools. And this is the one I have to give the disclaimer for, because this is not an official opinion or stance. But from everything I've seen, the tape test is uniquely biased against muscular women. And that's a problem we need to solve if we're trying to push women into combat roles. The women who are the best at the things we want women to be good at are treated the least fairly by the body composition test we have in place. And that is something I think at least the researchers are very aware of, and hopefully soon the policymakers will start to address that as well. But I do agree with you on the surface that focus on performance and the aesthetics, so to speak, the body composition will follow if you're training in a smart way. Take care of whatever issues you're having in terms of weaknesses or imbalances and things like that. Don't worry as much about the body composition. Just focus on overall healthy habits, eating well, training well, getting consistent sleep, all of that kind of stuff. I've never been one to focus on training for body composition, and I'd hope that most soldiers wouldn't either, because that can lead down a dark path in terms of like emotional relationship with food and things like that.
Yeah, no, I love hearing that. And I think it's a very well-balanced answer. Great advice, especially for our postpartum crowd. And I said I was going to save this for the end, but I feel like this is a great segue into this question about health. And I'm just curious how you, as a military leader, would define health, and how your journey through becoming a master fitness trainer and into your current position has changed that definition.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this one-on-one earlier, but a lot of people focus on like the tiny details. They watch like professional athletes on Instagram or influencers or whoever it is and try and copy some of like the really nuanced things they're doing. And I think it's important to have a good understanding that for most of us, like those of us who aren't making money off of the physical performance we can produce on any given day, longevity is going to be way more important than detailed kinds of performance. I think sleep is way more important than the Army tends to recognize. I think if you've watched any of the or seen any of the news articles about the new FM7-22, the biggest thing everybody picked up on is that naps are now doctrinal. I'd encourage people to read a little more of that sleep chapter because there's more to it than napping, but sleep is critical for body composition. Sleep is critical for performance. It's more than we realize. Like if you're eating in a calorie deficit and sleep deprived, you're more likely to lose muscle than fat. If you're eating in a calorie surplus and sleep deprived, you're more likely to gain fat than muscle. And that flips on its head if you're sleeping sufficiently. So some of the more foundational things like the way we sleep, the way we eat, the way we manage stress have really profound impacts on health. And I think that's something commanders need to get a grasp on so they can make sure they're setting the conditions for their soldiers to take care of themselves. After all of that, after you've learned to take care of yourself on that level and learn to move properly, like healthy foundational movement patterns, then we can start worrying about really technical programming and how to train. And after that is supplements. But so many of our soldiers are spending a bunch of money on supplements at the 5-star nutrition outpost, yet they're eating Pizza Hut for 2 meals a day and not getting enough sleep because they're playing Call of Duty all night. Like these are things we need to get a handle on as a force if we want people to be healthy.
Yeah. And I'll throw this, maybe curveball follow up to you. It seems like as commanders, especially in this time of COVID, we may have less and less influence directly over soldiers. How would you influence them in this positive way to eat healthier, to sleep better, to get the basics right before they focus on supplements?
Yeah, because this is actually a good question because it's an opportunity to sneakily answer that question and also the common question about how do Reserve and National Guard commanders prepare their units for something like the ACFT, because they already didn't have as much ability to influence the behaviors of their soldiers. So when you're seeing them less frequently, whether it's due to COVID or due to being in a reserve unit, some of the same strategies can apply. I think the biggest one is education. And it's something obviously I'm focused on as a master fitness trainer course instructor. But when we nerd out about education, we talk about 3 domains of learning. There's the cognitive domain, which is learning facts, recall, patterns, classroom kind of things, academic kind of things. There's the psychomotor domain of learning, which is a little more important in what we do than some other domains, but it's how to move properly, how to execute tasks, things you have to practice to get good at. But the domain that's most important to us in the Master Fitness Trainer course is the affective domain of learning, which is getting people to care about the material, getting them to internalize it as part of their identity. So if you have limited time to interact with soldiers, having one fantastic workout and then not seeing them again for a month isn't going to do anything. But educating them, teaching them how to use these things in their own life, and then convincing them to care about it, that's what's going to make a difference, because nothing matters more in fitness and health than consistency. So we have to show them what right looks like, convince them that it's important, and get them to start making those gradual changes in how they live.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of this one time, and I'll throw this story out there because I feel like some people might be able to use it right now. So I had this one company commander who used our family readiness group meeting to bring in a nutritionist and a master fitness trainer to talk to not just our soldiers, but our soldiers and families. And their theory at the time was, if I can influence the families and all of the habits that are going on with the families at home, that when I release this soldier for the day, that they're a lot more likely to stick with these good habits and implement the influence and the education that I've shared with them throughout training and throughout the day. And it really had this amazing effect. I think it really got down to the core and showed, if the family was bought in and it became a habit over time, and it wasn't just the soldier trying to come home and also influence their family to change, it was a lot more effective. And I thought that was a really great idea. And I think it's something even virtually that could be shared right now. So I love how you talk about those tiers of learning. It's a great idea. And I think there are a lot of creative ways to implement that. Do you have any other stories of how commanders have gone about that?
You made me think of one real specific one that I think is great. If anybody on here is at Fort Drum, they might be aware of this, but even though H2F officially launched just in October, it has been in a pilot phase for 2 years before that at several installations, JBLM, Drum, Bragg, a couple others. But Derek Anderson is an Army dietitian up at Fort Drum who's been involved in the H2F pilot and is now even more involved in full scope H2F up there. But he found that for the married soldiers in the battalion he was responsible for, it had more impact to teach the cooking and nutrition classes to the spouses than it did to the soldiers. So that's what he did. Like during the duty day, soldiers are off doing stuff. If the spouses are available, he'd bring them in, or in the evenings, he'd do couple stuff, because a lot of these soldiers don't really have a ton of control over what they're eating. That decision is made by a spouse. They just kind of go with it. So teaching some of this stuff and it comes back to the idea of holistic health and fitness, right? It's more than just what you do on duty. It's more than like the tiny adjustments at the DFAC. It comes back to the lifestyle the soldiers are living, and their family has a huge part in how that plays out. So absolutely.
Man, I love hearing good stories like this. And I feel like it is one of those things, a lot of commanders, we have so many problems on our plate and the issue may seem so big, but getting after something like this can easily be outsourced. And to know that we have those people already kind of at our disposal is fantastic to hear. And one of those things too, that we can just kind of bring them in, throw them at the problem and see what sticks with our soldiers. So I love hearing that. And I'd love to hear more about H2F. I know we've talked at length about the good that H2F can do for the military. Can you first let the audience know what you think the best thing is, and what is one thing you would change about H2F's initiatives?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to culture. So this is kind of the best thing and the thing we can do to influence it and make it good. This will be owned at the brigade level. Assets will get pushed down to the battalion level. Company commanders will certainly have a decision in their company's engagement with the program or not. And I think that's going to be where we find out how effective this is going to be. When Thor was initially rolled out in special forces, there was not a lot of engagement on it. And even today, there are ODAs and teams out there that treat Thor as simply a faster way to get physical therapy access. And it's so much more than that. And the same problems are going to come up with H2F, where unless people buy in, it's not going to be what it's capable of being. So if you're out there in a leadership position, and I know we're talking a lot to commanders, but this is anybody in any kind of leadership position, formal or informal, down to like team leaders or just role model soldiers. If your unit gets H2F resourcing, if you have strength coaches available, engage them proactively, because all these guys know they have to manage expectations. They're not going to change everything overnight. At the end of the day, they can provide advice, but commanders, first sergeants and sergeant majors are the ones who will make the real decisions about what gets done. So if you know, like if you followed like good strength and conditioning programming as an athlete before, or if you've found that it helped you prepare for some kind of selection, or you just use it for yourself individually, and you know this evidence-based approach really works, you now need to be that influence on your formation. Talk about H2F, nudge them to bring them in, get programming in place. So it's not just your squad leader making something up the night before on what to do for PT. It's something designed progressively. So it's all about cultural change. The Army's really big. When the boat's that big, it's really hard to turn it, but helping nudge it in the right direction and helping these professionals as they get thrown into this have a bigger impact than they could without somebody down in the formation helping them out. And that's what we're trying to create our MFTs to do. We know they only get 2 weeks of training, which is nothing compared to the like bachelor's and master's degrees some of these strength coaches are going to have, but we want them to be kind of like the interns or the assistant strength coaches that help get this message out to the rest of the force.
Yeah, it sounds like there is a lot of potential payoff for early buy-ins from stakeholders. I know this is one of those things where the military will have a lot of different pilot programs, and typically it might be tasked down to kind of become that stakeholder, but every now and then leaders get to have the opportunity to raise their hand and say, I'll try this out. I know, for example, on a few different posts, we've had specific gyms open, and commanders can volunteer to hold their units PT sessions there, receive that extra individual strength training, and let their trainers kind of dive in and become part of the units on post. And so I have seen the huge payoff, especially for those volunteer units who say, I'll try it. And I'm just curious if you think that there are any other benefits for those early stakeholder buy-ins.
Absolutely, because they're the ones who are going to get to shape how this thing ends up working. I know a lot of installations are trying to create their own kind of troop schools designed to train people to implement this program a little bit better, all sorts of things like that. And if you're first in line, you're going to get the most access to it. And it's worth noting now that H2F didn't come out of nowhere. Installations have been trying to do programs like this for a long time. I know I was at Fort Carson for a long time. They had the Tactical Athlete Program, which became Iron Horse Human Performance Optimization. Up at Drum when I was there, it was Mountain Athlete Warrior. JBLM has Bayonet Athlete Warrior. Hawaii has Lightning Athlete Warrior. Just insert division Athlete Warrior has been tried everywhere. The reason H2F is being created at the Army level is because those programs tended to live and die based on who was CG at the time. The CG would determine funding with end of year discretionary funds. If you had a CG who really cared, the program would be awesome. Then he would leave, funding would disappear. They'd throw whatever NCO happened to be available at it and hope they figured out something good. But I know my email address will be available after this. If you're at an installation where you're trying to track down some of those cool resources, you're not sure if H2F is there yet or what is there. Part of the one of the coolest aspects of being an MFT instructor is going on all these MTTs, teaching at these installations and finding the awesome, motivated professionals that are out there already trying to make an impact. Like Neil Santiago in Hawaii is doing really awesome stuff with Lightning Athlete Warrior. He's secured a gym. He's got a class program put together. That's kind of on hold with COVID. The Tactical Athlete Program continues to thrive at Fort Carson. Mountain Athlete Warrior has been, they just sent a lot of their instructors through our course. So there's really cool stuff happening out there that we can point you in the right direction to try and find out whatever's in place already so you can be kind of the early adopter of H2F. Absolutely.
No, I love that. And I've seen a lot of, I'd say, grassroots initiative in this case. It's fantastic if soldiers find themselves at an installation where they have all of these resources and people willing to set that example physically and in a leadership capacity. But what would you do and recommend for those folks who look around, don't see anyone, they look at themselves and they may be unqualified? How can they get started? How can they find someone to get this going for them?
Absolutely. Obviously, as an MFT instructor, I should tell you first, find your local MFT, hit them up. But we talked yesterday about some awesome resources that are out there that hopefully we can shine a spotlight on people doing really good work. First off, U.S. Army Physical Fitness School is on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're on YouTube. We try and push out good content. The Leg Tuck program was there. Earlier on in COVID, we were putting out a lot of at-home workout content. Once we got back to teaching classes, that kind of drew down a little bit, but I don't know exactly what's coming in the next couple of months, but we may be back in the garage gyms doing our videos for people. So we'll see what happens there. A couple we had talked about, these are unofficial resources. These are certainly not Army resources, but for women in particular, Kim Armstrong, her company is called Going, Doing, Living. She's doing really, really great work and is very focused on things people can do with limited access to gyms or equipment. Really awesome stuff. She's on Instagram, fantastic resources there. And she has whole programs out there for ACFT improvement. A fellow West Pointer has put together a website called Training for 600. The URL is armycombatfitnesstest.com. Not sure how the Army didn't secure that one first, but he was way ahead of it. Awesome blog on there with really good educational resources on foundational exercise science concepts, how to train for individual events, lots of video content, really, really good stuff. I know we'd also talked briefly earlier about the Valkyrie project. They're worth checking out, especially if you're looking for personalized training, especially for women who are trying to go to some sort of elite school or selection. Meg is great. And then more officially, army.mil/ACFT is the official ACFT website. The Army doesn't always get this right, but this website is actually pretty good. It's got training resources. It's got links to anything you would need. We're hoping to update it right now. Trying to get on there a PDF of what's required to be certified as a grader and a link to, if it's not already there, the ACFT online training that we've already put in place. I know it just got updated to reflect the FM. For my commanders in the group, I would not recommend certifying people just based on the online training, but it is a really great way to establish a good baseline before conducting some hands-on training with people so they know how to grade properly. And then we have a mill suite that has a ton of stuff. I'll make sure that link gets to you, Michelle, so you can drop it on the Facebook page along with a bunch of other resources once we're done.
Yeah, awesome. So I have two follow-on questions there. The first one is you talked about certifying individuals for the ACFT. As a company commander or any kind of leader in the military who can certify someone, who should I be looking for and who should I be avoiding?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll make sure the actual like annex from the Frago gets to you so you can drop that for everybody. But the bottom line is early on in the ACFT implementation, the only way to get certified was by either one of our teams from the physical fitness school coming to you or you coming to us, or there's also one team based out of Fort Eustis that was doing the same thing. That transitioned to a train the trainer kind of model. So we've been to almost every installation probably 2 or 3 times at this point between all the 6 teams we had traveling the globe for a while. Find somebody who has already been certified and they should be prepared to run some pretty quality ACFT grader certification training for you. If that's truly not available at all and pending any COVID travel changes in guidelines, it is possible to send an NCO TDY to Fort Jackson and we do run in-house classes on that. It's 3 days long. But I'd recommend just finding somebody who's already been through our certification and can run that for you guys. Just make sure if they went through it a year or 2 ago, most of us here know that has changed a little bit. Make sure they take a second to look at the new manual. It's ATP 7-22.1. It's not in the FM. It's a separate document on testing. It's pretty straightforward. I try to tell people this all the time, but it is just a PT test. It's not very complicated. You have E7s and second lieutenants running ranges on less guidance than we're trying to do a PT test. So I promise it can get done.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of guidance out there. I've done my best to keep up with all of the readings, and I feel like every time I turn around, there's something new. But I think that's what we are looking for in an environment like this, trying to stay as agile as possible. So I did say I had a second question, and I love hearing about these internal and external resources. I especially love seeing all of these videos that people are posting on websites. If we're stuck in our garage gym or a parking lot spot or wherever we're working out these days, I love seeing people being able to film themselves and post it up somewhere on social media or, on their unit's Facebook page to elicit some feedback on how they're doing. Because I know typically an in-person PT, we have someone standing there guiding us, giving us feedback in real time. As an individual and a leader, how can I differentiate or provide some guidance to my soldiers on differentiating the advice from your average Joe on Facebook saying, here's how I recommend doing a leg tuck, or it's all messed up, from someone who is certified or educated and experienced on very complicated movements such as a deadlift?
Yeah, absolutely. You already mentioned it, but there's a ton of stuff out there. I think it's been pretty cool to see, pretty uplifting. If you go on Instagram and search the hashtag ACFT, you'll see an outrageous amount of content. Some of it's advertising, absolutely, but a lot of it is just soldiers trying to improve their own personal level of physical fitness. And it's really cool to see people getting motivated about that, even with all the weirdness that's come with COVID and the test not being enforceable in terms of any kind of punishment for failure. People still see it on the horizon and are making changes and improving. But like you said, when it's so decentralized like that and it's just out on social media, it's hard to know who to trust. I think just about everyone, whatever level of fitness or athleticism they're at, can benefit from having a coach. But finding the right coach is pretty complicated. And we know that like saying somebody's a personal trainer doesn't necessarily mean a lot if you don't know where the cert came from. We could go really far down this rabbit hole, but I would look for people with certifications from reputable organizations, most notably like National Strength and Conditioning Association. ACE is pretty good. ACSM is very good. The Performance Enhancement Specialist certification is a really good one. Some CrossFit coaches are fantastic. Just because they went to level 1 doesn't mean they're a great coach, but you can find out pretty quickly how knowledgeable someone is. So I think CrossFit gyms can be a really good resource if they're the right kind of gym and they have somebody knowledgeable doing the coaching. Yeah, there's a lot out there. I mean, some companies are coming up right now doing really good things. Strong First is doing cool stuff. That's where Kim Armstrong got a lot of her products from. And And then OPEX is doing stuff in the CrossFit world, trying to make it a little bit more evidence-based, science-based. So you'll see some stuff like that. And OPEX is fantastic at training that is focused on longevity and health, not necessarily competitive performance. So absolutely.
Yeah. So I have, again, 2 follow-on questions there, but these are about mindset. I know we talked about CrossFit, which I think can be a little bit controversial for some folks, because when you walk into a CrossFit gym and they say or advertise that they'll be helping you train up for the ACFT, and you walk in and you're not doing ACFT exercises, what are they getting after? Why is it good for us to perform exercises that are not simply the exercises from the ACFT?
Absolutely. And this comes back to what I said earlier about, we don't want people training for the test. We know for decades, the Army has been training for the APFT, which seems simple and seems safe on the surface because you're not doing any weird, crazy movements. But the imbalance that comes from training that way leads to a really high rate of overuse injuries, mostly looking at like lower body musculoskeletal injuries, but also lower back and shoulders are common issues for soldiers. And in the units that have implemented the ACFT, we've actually seen those injury rates go down pretty significantly now that they're training in a more well-rounded way. So those like acute injuries that people are worried about having, like throwing out their back or something like that, are statistically much less of a concern than the overuse injuries people get from just training in an imbalanced, poorly programmed way for years and years. So that's a huge piece of it. And even though the ACFT is an improvement on the APFT, we still don't want them just religiously training the exact movements from the ACFT. We've seen a lot of units do like an ACFT circuit as their PT, where they just do a little bit of every movement. It's not the worst thing in the world, but I think we can do better than that. Just because the deadlift is on the test doesn't mean you shouldn't also be squatting. That'll help balance it out so you have healthy knees. A lot of overuse injuries just come from like a push-pull imbalance across a joint. So if people have elbow tendonitis or patellar tendonitis, that's probably because one set of muscles, whether the pulling muscles or the pushing muscles, got stronger because of the way they train. We see that a lot. Obviously, current Army soldiers do tons and tons and tons of push-ups and not a whole lot of any kind of pulling, whether that's on a pull-up bar or similar. And that's where the struggle with the leg tuck is coming from, but it's also where shoulder injuries are coming from. So I think just because you're not doing the actual movements doesn't mean you aren't training the appropriate component of fitness, whether that's strength, power, anaerobic capacity, aerobic capacity, all these nerdy things we see in some of these training certifications out there. It is important to understand that, at least on the surface. And that's why the Master Fitness Trainer course exists, is so that they can train soldiers in a little bit smarter, healthier way. But you started the question by asking about mindset. And I think that's honestly the most critical thing, because you could have the perfect program, and if it's not executed with like the commitment and the intensity that comes with a good mindset, you're not going to see the results you should. And somebody executing a pretty flawed, problematic program with a lot of belief and a lot of intensity and a lot of consistency is going to see awesome results, even though the program wasn't perfect. So we need to get people in the right mindset to believe they can improve and commit to the steps they're going to take to see that improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it, and this is just kind of a background story on myself, when I was in, we used to have these, what I thought were silly rules about all of your morning PT having to be based on exercises out of an official Army publication. And I felt very restricted by this, having a background in cross training and implementing all of these varied exercises and the benefits that come from that. And then we started doing crazy dodgeball stuff and, stuff like that. But what I'm continuing to hear that I feel is very positive is to break outside of these publications. What are, and I know we've talked about some resources already, but what are some creative ways that you've seen people break the mold on these publications and come up with some creative, beneficial training for their units?
Yeah, so two-part answer to that one. One, there has been dramatic improvement in what is in the manual. The exercise portion of the FM has been broken off into its own publication. So we already said FM 7-22 is the manual. It's got all the concepts. Then ATP 7-22.1 is testing. That's your OPAT, your ACFT, and your water survival test. And then the second one is ATP 7-22.2, which are all of the exercises. It's just a manual full of exercises. And And that's dramatically expanded from what you saw in physical readiness training. There's still all of the PRT exercises and drills in there, but there's a bunch of barbell stuff, dumbbell stuff. There's even a set of like landmine drills and medicine ball drills, a bunch of tools out there for people to use. But we also know that no one has created like the Bible of exercise, right? You're not going to find one document that has every exercise you should do. I know you and I are both huge fans of Palloff presses as an awesome core exercise that requires almost no equipment. You're not going to find that one in there. So we know that the manual is not perfect. It doesn't have every single tool we would want, but it's a great baseline for people who are uncomfortable in the gym, haven't been through any kind of formal strength and conditioning before, to establish a decent baseline on what are some good movements for various components of strength and different body parts and different muscle groups. But you're absolutely right. We all know the way doctrine works. Everybody in here is an officer, right? You have to know the doctrine before you deviate from the doctrine. So once you know the basics, you can start to apply some of the cooler stuff you might know, something you saw somewhere else, something you really liked from your own personal training, that you can start to apply as well, as long as you're continuing to get after the right components of fitness, and as long as you've assessed your soldiers and know they're ready for it.
Yeah. And again, kind of a personal story, but I had to have the mental shift as a leader when I started to encourage my subordinates to lead PT and come up with creative solutions on their own to help implement us and get us medal ready. I started seeing some crazy stuff that people had ideas for. And initially as a leader, I was like, oh my gosh, I know I didn't have a great attitude about it, because I was like, what is this crazy exercise? I'm going to look like a fool in front of my soldiers, not knowing how to do this. And after I saw a few of my senior NCO leaders take on this fantastic positive mentality of embracing a new exercise or something they weren't good at, they didn't even say anything to me. It was like this mental shift I had just by good example of being able to put on my white belt, learn something new. And I saw the biggest payoff with that when it came to the ACFT. I think we were doing the standing power throw, which admittedly I was not good at whatsoever in the very beginning. And being able to pick up this new piece of equipment to me, even though I'd seen it at the gym every day when I was there, and look silly, try something new. I think I hit the ceiling one time, but to receive feedback and show my soldiers, like, I'm new at this too, I'm trying to figure it out. It really, I think my mental shift and acceptance of being a beginner again, having to learn something new and have a positive mentality about it, I think it went a long ways, because after that, I saw a lot more of my soldiers willingly walk up to a new piece of equipment, be it, the med ball or the hex bar, and just try. And I think it was a lot more fun and less pressure, which is something we should be aiming to create right now, since there is no consequence for it. And I think just having that positive mentality around it is going to be a huge help. And that kind of brings me to my second mindset question. And this is one mostly for leaders, because in the past, I know, especially on OERs, what we were looking for was that bullet point that said 300 APFT score. And it was like, if you didn't have that, something's wrong, or if it didn't say what your score was. And it was almost like a given, like, this is what you should be scoring if you're a leader, and I think we are having to really just kind of break that mold completely moving forward. So how can we help to change that culture at our own individual level to show other officers, NCOs, it's okay not to have that bullet? How do we reward small progress? How do we help to set a new standard based off of this scoring scale that is completely changing?
Yeah, so I think it's going to be complicated, and it's going to affect different populations in different ways. I think some of the people who have the most right to be concerned are kind of our junior soldiers and junior NCOs, for whom promotion points are so critical, and who are waiting to find out how promotion points will be calculated based on ACFT scores. I can't go into detail on that because it's still stuff that's in progress. That's at levels much higher than me. But they have some potentially creative ways to implement that. It might be tied to like how you perform compared to your demographic or your MOS or things like that. It might not be a raw number. but there's a lot of things we can shift here. And the first one is that a lot of people have shown a ton of frustration at their weaknesses being exposed by a new test. And what we try and come back to here, out in the civilian world, like training clients, athletes, whoever it is, these people pay a lot of money to help to get somebody smart to come find their weaknesses and start fixing them. So a shift in mindset where we can appreciate that a weakness has been found that could become a problem for me down the road in combat. And now I can fix it now instead of getting much more severe, potentially life-threatening consequences down the road. A lot of the slide decks we've seen presenting to Army senior leaders cite one particular instance. It was a male captain, I think, might've been a first lieutenant. He deployed, he'd always gotten like 300s on his APFT, even like rolling out of bed after a bad night, might get like a 290, didn't worry about PT. But it turns out that APFT style fitness was not what mattered when he got to combat, was engaged. They were doing some like some kind of urban situation. I don't know the deal, but they were trying to exfil. He had to get over a relatively short wall, something like 4 or 5 feet tall. But as fatigued as he was in the kit he was carrying with his weapon, with his radio, all that stuff, found himself unable to negotiate it on his own and in need of help from other soldiers. So I would rather that weakness get found here during a leg tuck on a pull-up bar than be found in Afghanistan when you're stuck in an alleyway trying to get over a wall, right? So that's a huge piece of the mindset, is appreciating that the test is finding those things and helps us program training that will fix those things for our soldiers. And the second piece is figuring out how to recognize people for more than just a raw score. I think at some point a score will take the place of what used to be the 300. I don't know if it'll be 500 as like, you're really good. Everything above that's kind of extra. I don't think you're going to see a lot of 600s. We do see them, but those are pretty rare. And to get there, you have to train somewhat specifically for the test on top of a really good foundation of fitness. And that's not really what we want PT to be. We don't want people to be that stressed about a particular number on a test. You talked about PT should be fun. Like, it should be a time where you're doing things that make you feel better. It should be some team bonding for the unit. All of those things are things we want. And once we figure out how promotion points will be handled and how promotions and separations and bars and all of those things will be figured out, which is happening up at DAG1 right now, hopefully we come out with some solid policies that don't result in soldiers having to wildly overemphasize the test itself. And we can focus on fitness in general. And you can recognize people for leading good programs and implementing good programs and reducing injury rates and things like that, not just their own individual performance.
Right. Yeah. It's a huge, not just re-strengthening and reworking of our physical programming, but also of our mental programming here, especially as leaders. So it seems like there are many different moving pieces in the works right now. And if we just stay flexible, I think that seems like our best course of action. I know the audience has heard so many different creative solutions and good news stories, but at the end of the day, I still experienced at the end of my time that if there was no plan for PT, the automatic default for programming was always, either that 5-mile run, 30 60s, or a push-up sit-up drill, even with the new implementation of the ACFT. So I know scoring is one mindset that we're going to have to change. How do we change this mindset of what has typically been our PT default?
Yeah, we know that's a default. Depending on where you go, it's even more running heavy. You'll see places that run 3, 4, 5 days a week. I would refer anyone who wants to nerd out about it to the Health of the Force report. It's published every year. It has data on like overweight and obesity rates. It has data on injury rates, things like that. And that culture was not working for us. The injury rate was through the roof and hugely problematic. We're talking about a number of soldiers on profile to the point that you're looking at like a dozen brigades worth of soldiers that aren't in the fight because they're injured. So we absolutely need to change that culture. And we know that there are elite athletes out there who only train 3 days a week and achieve really, really high levels of physical fitness. I think the Army culturally underestimates the importance of rest and recovery to achieve improvement. You don't get stronger when you're in the gym. You don't get faster while you're running. You actually get weaker. You're breaking down your muscles. You're using up your fuel. You get faster and stronger because of the super compensation that occurs when you're resting, when you're recovering, when you're sleeping, when you're eating. So changing that is going to be huge. I think it kind of drives home the point to see that despite the fact that we're running so much, a huge portion of our population still isn't very good at running. So something's very wrong with the programming we're doing and the approach we're taking. I think we train to failure too often. You hear like runs are always like focused on getting the weaker people to fall out. And then the muscular endurance days are frequently referred to as muscle failure days. If we go to the research, that's not what works. If you look at elite martial arts fighters, they do not ever train to the point of soreness because that would negatively impact their ability to train technique. And that's kind of important for a lot of our soldiers too. You can absolutely get fitter without ending up in a puddle, writhing on the ground in fatigue, and then being super sore for the next 2 or 3 days. That is not necessary to achieve results. So I think we have to change that. We should expect, if commanders are using their MFTs properly, if they have H2F strength coaches, all these resources, I think we should expect better planning on physical training than we currently do. We expect to see planning in place ahead of time for ranges, for field training, for everything else. And for whatever reason, the one thing we do every single day, we fail to plan terribly effectively, and we just wing it half the time when we get there. I would want to see something where you have a program where you know what the goal is, you know what you're doing to get better at that goal, you're measuring progress, and not to get into the exercise sciencey terms, but progressive overload has to be planned in. And we should be tracking it somehow to see that it's actually working. And if we're not doing that, we're failing our soldiers and setting them up for injury.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the thought of intention going into something, knowing why am I doing this? We talk about task and purpose all the time as leaders. And I feel like one place it typically gets glossed over or just given the rubber stamp label of fitness and readiness is PT. One of the things you touched on was that it may not take training every day of the week, but a lot of units have a mandatory 1 hour PT session every day. I'd like to tie in a talking point that you had earlier about education. Have you ever seen any good programs where they may not train for the entire hour physically, but use part of that time to educate people on other areas that feed into PT and readiness?
Absolutely. And a lot of this comes back to whatever your first sergeant or sergeant major is actually going to accept and be okay with. So you have to tread carefully here. It's a huge opportunity to do like technique improvement kind of education, because that at least looks like working out and will keep them happy. We teach MFTs to program 1 day of active recovery. So that involves some pretty low intensity work. And we often tell them, because the words active recovery don't always sell well on a PT program, you can mask that behind like things like flexibility and mobility improvement. That might sound a little better to sergeant major, but what it really means is you're doing like yoga or foam rolling or stretching or something like that. And that doesn't sound very hard and intense like the Army wants to see. But if it gets you better results, it doesn't matter what it looks like. And you can prove that with the performance that your unit sees down the road and eventually change the culture a little bit. We've harped on mindset a lot, and there's one story I kind of want to share that I think will be valuable here. I'm borrowing this from a strength coach I used to work with at Fort Carson. But he used to ask soldiers, how do you know if a workout was good, right? And their answers tend to be the same as we see from any civilian who goes to the gym, right? I want to be tired. I want to be sore. I want to be sweaty. Cool. And we know that that's what leaders in the Army currently kind of do look for, is those exact things. They want to see people suffering, pushing really hard, reaching failure, and demonstrating grit and toughness. Great. But if our measure of a good workout is sore, tired, and sweaty, his one-liner response to that was awesome. All right, cool. Meet me in the sauna, 3 a.m. I'll punch you in the face. You're going to be sore because you just got punched in the face. You're going to be tired because it's 3 a.m. And you're going to be sweaty because you're in a sauna. And it didn't do a damn thing to improve your performance or your health, right? So when you dig a little bit deeper, and we do this with our MFTs, the only way to know if a workout is good is whether it got you closer to your goal. And a lot of our units and a lot of our soldiers don't know what their goal is. Like hopefully most Army leaders are familiar with SMART goal setting: specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time constrained. We need to have a SMART goal, like a very specific goal in mind, and then we need to be measuring progress towards it. And that way we can find out what works and what doesn't and start to adjust as we go. And I'll bet once you figure out what your real goal is, that a ton of push-ups, a ton of sit-ups, and a ton of running are not the way to get there.
Yeah. Man, so much great information here. You know, Alex, I can't thank you enough for answering the 1,000 questions that we've had for you. And you've talked intensely about all of these internal and external resources, recommendations for social media pages we should follow, other trainers, just great information that's out there. I will make sure to post that on our West Point Women's page following this. And if there are any other questions that people have, how can we reach out to you?
Absolutely. Easiest way, my email address, which I'm sure you'll be able to share on the page, is alexmorrow2013@gmail. Feel free to reach out to me there. If you're on the West Point Careers and Networking page, I'm the one making the snarky comments on people's posts, so you can easily find me that way. I'm happy to help if anybody has any questions down the road. And I'll certainly email you, at the very least, that leg tuck program and a couple of good links.
Awesome. And again, I'm Michelle Thibeau, and you guys can find me at michelle@thibeautraining.com. And Alex, thank you again so much for all of your time and effort going into this. And I really look forward to continuing this conversation, because I know we will have so many follow-on questions as the ACFT is implemented in so many new ways with a lot of new people. So thank you again.
Absolutely. Thank you. And good luck to everyone as we start to make some of these changes.
Yep. See you, Alex.
Bye.